you'll get a certification sent out in the mail, email out to you. And if you didn't do that and you need it, just let us know. If you have any questions during this webinar, you're welcome to type them in the little question box that's on there. I cannot guarantee that I'm going to be able to get. I suspect there might be a lot of questions, and I can't guarantee that I'm going to get to all of them. So write them in there. We'll print them out and then send answers out as we can. I have to cut this webinar. You'll all get your full credits, but I do have to cut this webinar off a little short because of an appointment that I have. So that's necessary for me. So anyway, let's jump into it. Okay, we're going to cover a lot today. We are going to one of the things we're going to cover most every topic in wage and hour. In wage and hour, we're going to just focus on federal law. There's a couple things on state law that we'll breeze by, but for the most part, we're going to be talking almost entirely on federal law. And one thing that we're not going to talk about is I'm not going to talk a ton about the exempt employee classifications, like sales employees and outside salespeople and the retail exemption and the executive administrative professional. We'll glance on that. I'll talk about it briefly, but I'm not going to really get deep into the duties on that issue. So we're going to talk about a lot of these other issues like regular rate of pay and calculating regular rate of pay because it's complicated and because a lot of companies still mess it up, and a lot of payroll systems aren't sophisticated enough to handle it. And so we really need to make sure that we have a full understanding of how to calculate and what is the regular rate of pay. We're going to talk about overtime, within that framework. We're going to talk about a bunch of issues beyond those listed here. So we're going to talk about on-call time for sure, but we're going to talk about interns, and we're going to talk about travel time, and we're going to talk about waiting time and donning and doffing. So we're going to hit a lot of different topics. One thing I should say for a lot of you, I don't remember the exact number, but the PowerPoint here was very large. It's not PowerPoint, it's Canva. But anyway, the PDF on this was very large, and so a lot of people, their IT system wasn't kicked it back to us. And so if you really want a copy of this, you'll have to reach out to the HR hotline at thompsonco.com or the contact information they have in registering for this webinar. So just reach out to us, and we'll somehow get it over to you, break it down in a couple files or something like that. But just to let you know, a lot of people's IT systems couldn't take the size of this PDF here because it's such an incredibly awesome topic, and so it necessitates a lot of slides and information. Okay, so let's talk about some core principles. This is a complex. I really intend this to be for fairly in-depth, more complicated training than that you might see. A lot of this is not one-on-one, but let's talk about some core principles, because my experience is that even people who are really, really good at wage and hour laws, there's so much out there that just some of these general concepts still get lost, and so it's still worth I think reviewing them. And I guarantee anybody, you could be a really awesome, I shouldn't say guarantee, but really awesome wage and hour person and understand all the nuance, but I think there will be something in this webinar for you for certain, and it'll your money back if for whatever reason you don't learn one single thing here today. Okay, so core principles. The most basic core principle that we have is that all employees need to be paid for hours worked. Now, for the most part, about 90% or so of this webinar, we're going to be talking about non-exempt employees. So when I'm talking about regular rate of pay and I'm talking about working time, I'm talking about non-exempt employees. The exempt employees we don't really care all that much about. They don't have to be paid the minimum wage. They don't have to be paid. Some don't even have to be paid on a salary basis, like attorneys and doctors and teachers, for example, don't need to even be paid on a salary. But most of the issues that we have, we've got our little group of exempt employees, and meeting those duty requirements, that can be complicated. But today a lot of what we're going to be talking about is non-exempt employees. And so some of these core principles, like if you work more than 40 hours in a work week, you need to be paid 1.5 times the regular rate of pay. And that sounds really simple, but we're going to talk about some calculations on what exactly is included in the regular rate of pay. And so throughout the day, throughout the next 50 minutes, we're going to be talking about working time. And it's critical that we figure out what working time is. Because not all time that seems to be, quote, working time, and not all time that employers necessarily compensate employees for is technically working time. So for example, we'll talk about it more later, but for example, a lot of employers will pay employees to be on call, and they'll pay some sort of premium. But that's not necessarily, it could be working time, but it probably isn't necessarily working time. And so when you have that extra compensation, that's great, that's really nice of you, but it's not necessary in all situations. And so you might not have to pay. So for example, if it were working time on-call time, then you'd have to calculate it into overtime, into figuring out overtime. But if it's not working time, even if you're paying for it, it's still, you don't have to calculate it into the regular rate of pay. Well, you do have to calculate it into the regular rate of pay, but you don't have to calculate it into the overtime to figure out the 1.5 times, and whether it's more than 40 hours in a work week. There's some minor exception to the work week situation for certain nurses, for example, who where you can aggregate over a 2-week period. But for the most part, most every employee that we have out there is we're going to be looking at the work week per se, and not a 2-week period, even if that's how you do your payroll. That doesn't matter how you do your payroll. The key is that we look at the number of hours worked in a work week, and for all non-exempt employees, we have to keep track of those hours, the days and the times that the number of hours that are worked in a day. And again, if you have a HRIS, if you have a payroll system, if you have a time management system, you're going to be tracking all of this information. There's a lot of software and programs and everything out there that are going to do that. But just as general concepts, we need to track the hours. We need to figure out how many hours a person's worked in a day. And if in the work week, and whatever a work week is entirely defined by you, if there are more than 40 hours worked in that week, you need to pay them 1.5 times their regular rate of pay. The interesting tidbit, it kind of goes without notice. There's no cap on the number of hours that an employee can work. I guess that's the number of hours in a work week, that is the cap. But there's no, a lot of times employees will get cute and they'll say, no, you can't make me work more than 40 hours or 50 hours. And the answer to that is, you're absolutely wrong. I'm your employer, and if you want a job, you have to work 24 hours a day. Obviously, there are some exceptions for over-the-road drivers and so, but for the most part, conceptually, employers can require that employees work any shift. They can require that employees work any number of hours in a day. They can require that employees work any number of hours in a week. The only restriction, for the most part, and again, there are some state laws out there and stuff that we're going to forget about those for now, but under federal law, the only real restriction here is that if you're non-exempt, you have to be paid 1.5 times the regular rate of pay for all hours worked over 40. Otherwise, you can work 24 hours a day. Have at it. So non-working time, we have to understand what that is. So we really need to understand working time. We're going to talk about that more in depth. And then non-working time is exactly what that says. It's time that's not worked. So it's FMLA, it's work comp, it's PTO, it's holiday, military, certain travel time, certain on-call time. This is time when the person is not suffering or being permitted to work. And again, there are some nuances to that. We'll talk about those. But non-working time doesn't get calculated into the number of hours that are worked in a work week. And so we don't have to take that into consideration for the 40 or more hours. So if somebody's on work comp, or FMLA, a better example, if there's a holiday, well, that holiday is not working time. So if the person works 40 hours Monday through Thursday, so they work 4 10-hour days, and then you have Friday holiday, that's 48 hours in the week. and you might pay them straight time for the 48 hours. That's fine. That's what the law, would require, and what the contract, your holiday pay is a matter of contract, because there's no federal law or requiring that you pay employees for holidays, for holiday time off. So it's a matter of contract. So you're going to pay, in that situation, 48 hours of straight time. They're not entitled by law to 8 hours, the 48 minus 40. They're not entitled to 8 hours of overtime pay, because 8 of those hours they were sitting at home having turkey for dinner or holiday or whatever. That would be my Thanksgiving reference, which is probably a 2-day holiday. But anyway, and always on Thursday. Okay, so non-working time, we have to understand the concept of working time. We have to understand the concept of non-working time. For all jobs, we need to determine at the front end, we need to understand the job description. We have to understand the duties, and we have to classify them just for every single job. That's critical for an HR function, that we do that at the front end. It's going to drive how we understand these issues and how we apply all of these principles. The other thing that I mention a lot, because it can get complicated, but a lot of people miss this, is that you cannot, general principle, you can never take deductions that take somebody below the minimum wage. There are a lot of minimum wage workers out there. And if those minimum wage workers are required to purchase out of their own pocket, or even deducted from wages, or they just hand over $15 for a restaurant T-shirt, that technically, if it's required, and if it's a T-shirt that says restaurant ABC on it, and it's not the type of thing that you're going to wear out in public, on a date or whatever, then that's going to deduct from their wages. But the problem is, if they're already making minimum wage and you deduct anything from the minimum wage, $15 for a T-shirt, you're going to dip below the minimum wage. Absolutely not allowed. I don't care what the employee signs off on. I don't care if they paid it out of their pocket. If they pay it out of their own pocket, they write a check for it. It's an indirect deduction. If it comes out of payroll, it's a direct deduction. Either way, it's going to be illegal and prohibited under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So we have to watch deductions. Now, for a lot of your professional employees, it's not that big of a deal. You have them buy a T-shirt or whatever. Maybe you give them a T-shirt. Who cares? But $15 probably isn't going to take them under minimum wage. But for all those minimum wage workers out there, we really have to watch this. A lot of companies, especially if you're in hospitality, it can get pretty tricky with trying to have branded shirts and everything like that. I always mention it. Notice that every time I go into Target, everybody's wearing khakis and a red shirt. They're not wearing, for example, Target logoed. Take a look next time you go into Target. They're not wearing Target logoed clothing. They're wearing red shirts and khakis. Those red shirts and khakis, you could go to a movie in. You could go walk down the street, and not. Not that they're like the greatest looking thing in the whole world or anything, but the fact is, you could wear that red shirt and those khakis. Out and doing normal things. It doesn't scream Target only on there. And so as a result, people are, you could have a dress code that just says, wear khakis and a red shirt. And that's fine. And when you could have a dress code at your company that just says, business casual or business formal or whatever it is, doesn't mean you have to pay, and it doesn't mean you have to deduct from the wages, because as long as those people can wear those clothes, out in public and enjoy those clothes in other situations, then it doesn't have to come off of the regular rate of pay, and we don't have to look at it as going below the minimum wage. Other tidbits, just like holidays, just like holiday pay and premium pay, and there's no PTO, there's no federal law. They're talking about that, but there is no federal law right now that requires that employers give paid time off to employees. There are, we've talked about this a number of times over the last several months. There are a lot of states and municipalities that are going that direction and having sick and safety leave rules. But as a general concept under federal law, there is no paid time off, which is why every employer can have something different, because it's a matter of contract between you and the employees. Same with holiday pay. You are not guaranteed to get pay on Labor Day. That's just something most employers do. It's part of being competitive in the market for workers. That's why you do it. It's probably a historical, cultural type thing. But for the most part, yeah, you get to determine, Do you want to give holidays off? Do you not want to give holidays off? That's up to you to determine. Most employers do, but you don't have to. There's no law that requires it. At least no federal law that requires it. Same with premium pay. You do premium pay if you have like second or third shifts, for example. You're doing premium pay or hazard pay because it entices people to actually come in and work those second and third shifts. It's just, that's the marketplace, that's capitalism, right? That's not required. There's no requirement that you pay shift premium wages for those. There's no requirement that you pay any certain wage for any job. In the United States, you just have to pay minimum wage. So could you pay a CEO of Google minimum wage? Absolutely. There's no law saying that CEOs have to make, billions of dollars a year. That's not a law. So you could pay anybody anything, and premium pay is another example of that. Employees don't have to consent to work overtime at the federal level. A lot of employees think like, no, I get the choice. That's absolutely not the truth. Anytime you're requiring that an employee work any shift or overtime or any number of hours, you're essentially saying to that employee that this is a condition of your continued employment. Do this or you're going to be fired. If the employee does it, then they've met the condition. If they don't do it, if they don't perform the duties, if they don't do the hours, then they failed to meet that condition for you, and then it's up to you to either discipline and discipline up to and including termination. And that's how you get to a disciplinary situation. But there's no affirmative consent. If an employee wants to not work on Thanksgiving, you could say, you could do that, or you could not have a job. Not saying it's the greatest employee relations move in the whole world, but as a matter of law, as a matter of principle, could you fire somebody for not working 24 hours on Thanksgiving or 24 hours on Labor Day? Absolutely. You can get rid of them if they refuse to do it. You just effectuate your normal attendance policies and discipline accordingly. But the only requirement is that you pay them if they're not exempt, right? You pay them for any 1.5 times the regular rate of pay for any hours worked over 40. That's your limitation on that. Otherwise, you can make employees work any number of hours and have it be a condition of their continued employment. You can also reduce pay. A lot of employers forget, you can actually go down. You don't have to demote somebody. You don't have to change their duties. There's every work week. Let's just say work week starts on Monday. Every work week, you are essentially entering into a contractual agreement with that employee that in that work week, if they show up and work on Monday, they're going to get paid either their salary or their hourly rate that's been agreed upon. You can change that going into the next work week. You just need to give them notification like, hey, I know you're making $15 an hour today, but starting next week, you're going to be making $13 an hour. If they show up, they've accepted. You pay them $13 an hour. There's no entitlement to $15 an hour. This is employment at will. You're setting the terms here. You just need to notify them before the work week commences so that they can accept those terms. None of this really happens in writing, right? But I mean, this is essentially contractually how this is legally structured. You set the terms, they accept it by showing up to work. Okay. Regular rate of pay. I'm going to glance through this really fast, but then a lot of you, if you have the webinar, the copy of this, you can take a look at it later. If you're on the HR Hotline program, you can log in and rewatch this webinar as many times as you would like, and pause on some of these slides. But with regular rate of pay, the real key here is, well, first of all, what is the regular rate of pay? A lot of times we talk about hourly rate. That's really not, and we talk about paying overtime on the hourly rate. That's really not legally the full picture here. The regular rate of pay consists of everything that's paid to the employee, and so it's more than the hourly rate. It includes bonuses. It includes other forms of pay and compensation that the employee might get. So we want to lump all of that in to the regular rate of pay. We're not, when we pay overtime, we're not just doing it on hourly rate. We're doing it on the regular rate of pay, which might include, like I said, bonuses and commissions and stuff like that. And the only reason we really care, the only time this is of any sort of importance at all, is when the person works more than 40 hours in a work week. So as a general concept, when somebody works more than 40 hours in a work week, there's this 1.5 multiplier, and it's that 0.5. It's that 0.5 part that really messes us up on this. And so as a result, when we have to recalculate money into the regular rate of pay, that 0.5 throws things off. And so I have created some, okay, so I've created a key that will help you. A lot of you probably have payroll software systems that take care of all of this for you, and fantastic. But this is like, we're gonna try to learn and do the math on this. But this is how I look at things. And so again, this is a situation where there's extra money coming in, because if somebody's being paid $10 an hour and they work 45 hours, well, that's not, and there's no other money that comes in, no big deal. $10 an hour for the 5 hours of overtime, it's going to be $10 times 1.5, so that's $15 an hour. So you're going to have, a $5 premium, or a total of $60 in overtime pay, plus the 400, 10 times 40, plus the 400 that is at the regular rate. So that's not that big of a, that's not a problem. The problem comes in with, okay, so say you've got $10 an hour, you're making $10 an hour, and the person works 45 hours, but then you give some sort of performance bonus, and it ends up being $100. Well, that $100 needs to get taken into consideration. So really that $100 needs to be calculated back in. So really, the regular rate of pay really isn't $10 an hour. It's $100 an hour divided by 45, the total number of hours. And so that's, add that plus add that to the $10 hourly rate, and then do the multiplier, and it's a totally different number. It's not going to be $15 an hour. It's going to be like $16.75 or something like that. So that's why we do this calculation. So we've got monthly bonus or commissions. We've got all this. So this is our key right here. It even says key. And then we're going to look at formulas. Okay. So for example, this is how we can apply these formulas to figure out exactly what our regular rate of pay is going to be, and then what the commission part is. And I'm sorry, I was just seeing that people were starting to ask questions. So here we've got the key. So we've got the monthly. So we've got the monthly bonus. So we've got a monthly. Sorry, I'm gonna jump back and forth between these two. So we've got the monthly bonus or commission. So we're going to multiply that times. So if we have a monthly bonus, we're going to figure out what that breaks down to on a work week basis. So this is complicated. This is like a complicated situation where you get a monthly bonus, but really, again, because we're looking at work weeks, we need to figure out how that breaks down into the work week. So we're going to take the monthly bonus and we're going to figure it, and we're going to figure out what that looks like for the work week. So we're going to multiply it by 12 months, divided by 52, the number of weeks, and we're going to figure out what the weekly breakdown is. So if that weekly breakdown in my example before was like $100, that's how we would get to it. So the monthly bonus might be like, whatever it is, like 400 some and some change, but the weekly breakdown might be 100. So we're going to take the weekly breakdown and we're going to add it to the regular pay. And the regular pay under my previous example was, it was technically $450 because it was 45 hours. So 45 hours times 10 at the regular rate of pay is $450. So we would take the monthly bonus and we would add the $450, and then that would be the total compensation for the pay for the week. So I'll make sure so total compensation paid. So the total compensation, paid is the weekly bonus plus the regular rate of pay multiplied by the total number of hours, 45 in my example. So we've got $550 dollars. That's the total compensation. So then we need to figure out what the regular rate of pay is, right? Because the regular rate of pay is not going to be $10 an hour, right? So we would take the total compensation, and in my example, it's $550, and then we would divide it by the total number of hours. In this situation, 45. So you can throw in your own numbers on this. I'm just doing this off my head since I threw out that example. So divide by the total number of hours, which is 45 hours, and then that's going to be the regular rate of pay. And I'm actually going to like grab my phone and do the calculation. I think that's like $16.75 off the top of my head, but I might be completely wrong on it. I really should do these calculations like beforehand and actually think this through. Hopefully this is a good number. So 550 divided by 45 is, okay, sorry. So it's $12.22. So $12.22 per hour. So you can see what the regular rate of pay is. It's $12.22 versus the $10 an hour if you were just going like the person's just making $10 an hour. Because we had to calculate back in, you see what the impact is on this person's regular rate of pay. So then we have to figure out what the overtime is going to be, right? So the overtime is not going to be because $10 an hour is not the regular rate of pay. $12.22 is the regular rate of pay. We're going to have to figure out what that does for the overtime. So for the overtime, we're going to take the total number of hours, and that's 45, and we're going to subtract it from 40 being, at the regular rate of $10 an hour, and that's fine. But we're going to take the total hours, minus 40, and then that's the overtime hours, right? So 5 hours of overtime. I think that's a simple concept. And so we're going to take that, the overtime hours, and we can skip the next one, and we can go down and we can plug in the regular rate of pay into the 1.5 times the regular rate of pay. And I'll do that on my phone. And that's 1833. So 1.5 times 1222 is 1833. And you can see right there that that's $3.33 more than the $15 that the overtime premium, that the overtime pay would have been at $10 an hour. So you can see how this $100 is impacting us. So we've got $3.33 impact. So the regular rate of pay at the overtime premium is going to be $18.33. And so we figure out what the we just calculate that times the number of hours of overtime times 5, and there you go. There's your overtime premium. Add that to the straight pay, and you've got your calculation. But you can see how that $100 throws everything off. And if you have to calculate this monthly bonus, if there's overtime work, we don't care if there's no overtime because it's not going to be impactful. But if there is overtime, you're gonna have to keep doing this monthly bonus and breaking it down to the work week every single week that the person has overtime. And again, hopefully your payroll systems do this because this is a lot of math. And I know I promised no math, I completely promised math. But just so we all know how to actually do it by longhand, now you have the calculations right there. Okay, we're going to move on from that. Thanks for going through math with me. I really like math, and so this might be why this is my favorite type of presentation to get. But thanks for going through the math and not completely falling asleep and tuning me out if that's the case for you for those few minutes. Deductions from pay. As a general concept, we cannot deduct, we can't go below the minimum wage. General concept, you can't deduct from an exempt employee's wages. We're going to talk about 7 exceptions to that. However, you can, so a lot of states say that you cannot deduct anything, even for debts or lost property or uniforms or all the purchases, stolen things. You can't deduct from somebody's wages. There are way too many bad actor employers out there over the history of the United States. So the states have gotten really specific in saying, unless you have contemporaneous written authorization from an employee saying that you can deduct X amount of money from my paycheck on the next X paychecks, without that, in so many states, not all, but several, 2-3 handfuls of states, Minnesota and Texas included, you cannot do deductions from, I don't care if the person stole from you, you can't deduct from their wages without either getting a court order or like a garnishment or something like that, or you have to get a contemporaneous written authorization from them. A lot of states have a little bit of an exception to that, where they say, if you loan money and you have like a purchase agreement with the employee, you can loan them some money, and then you can just say like, we'll continue to take this money out of your wages. You could do some sort of upfront loan withdrawal thing. You don't have to keep getting written authorization every 2 weeks on this, but as a general rule, if you're trying to get some money, you're trying to collect from an employee a debt or whatever it is, you're going to need contemporaneous written authorization. That's just how it works, and that really sucks for employers. But in a lot of these states, that's the limitation. Now, for exempt employees, under the salary basis test, right, we cannot generally deduct from their wages, but there are 7 exceptions to that. So you can see the 7 exceptions. The most common one is for FMLA. So yeah, even exempt employees, they're not entitled to wages for FMLA. But also the 2 that employers don't always do, but they certainly could if they wanted to, is that if somebody's gone for a full day of personal leave, you can deduct a full day of wages. If the person works, then you got to pay them. But if they leave and they're gone for that full day of absence, then you can deduct their wages. If they've exhausted all their PTO, if they've exhausted all their PTO and they're sick or disabled, and they've missed a full day, you can deduct their wages. So these, even if they're an exempt employee. So there are 7 exceptions to this, and there's a lot more leeway than employers have. I would be very cautious about doing this. We have to be careful. We have to make sure that all the criteria is set out. But we can, as a general concept, when the circumstances set it up right, we can deduct from salaried exempt employees' wages without ruining the salary basis test. We're going to jump into a bunch of what is and what is not working time, quote, working time situations. The first one being on-call time. So on-call time is tricky. A lot of employers, in my experience, don't fully understand or appreciate it. A lot of employees think that there's a lot more entitlement to compensation for on-call time, more than is necessary. But the question is really, what it comes down to is, again, is this working time or not working time? And with on-call time, the question you need to ask yourself with your policy is, how restrictive am I being toward the employee with them requiring that they're on call time? So for example, you can imagine, and it's going to, every company and every geographic situation is different. And if you've heard me say this before, I'm sorry, but it's, I think the visual still works. If you are up in northern Minnesota, apologize to northern Minnesota, the middle of nowhere, and you've got a facility, and it's a small town, but the facility is out in the middle of nowhere, and you tell an employee, look, when you're on-call time, you can't be further than 10 miles from the office. Well, within 10 miles of the middle of nowhere is nothing. Maybe there's a gas station to go to. The person really can't enjoy themselves, right? If you have an office in Manhattan and you say, look, when you're on call, you have to be within 10 miles, there's a whole lot that you can do to enjoy yourself within 10 miles of an office in Manhattan. So completely same policy, completely different outcome. In northern Minnesota, it's going to be working time. You are restricting the person. You're requiring that they're within 10 miles. They really can't enjoy themselves. I don't care. They could be sitting there in their car listening to the radio or playing on their iPhone or whatever. That's fine. That's still going to be it's still going to be considered working time under those circumstances, versus a company in Manhattan that in New York, where you're within 10 miles of Manhattan, person can completely enjoy themselves. That's relaxation time. That's not working time. So one person's entitled to compensation, one person's not. You can see the list of questions questions here, but when it is considered working time, we're going to have to calculate that in. That's going to be considered hours worked, and so we're going to have to count that toward the overtime, the potential overtime premium. And again, we only care about non-exempt employees. Exempt employees should be working 24 hours a day, right? So non-exempt employees, we care about it. On call. If you pay somebody for on-call time, I should see if no. If you pay somebody for on-call time, even if it's not working time, so even if it's the person in Manhattan and it's not working time, we're not going to count it toward how many hours they worked in the work week. But if you pay them a premium or extra, you are going to throw that into their overall compensation, the total. That was it TCP that I put out on the spreadsheet before. You're going to put that into the total compensation paid. So that's like the bonus of $100 that we recalculate in. So whether it's working time or non-working time doesn't matter when we're trying to figure out what the regular rate of pay is. We only care about the working time versus non-working time with regard to the number of hours worked. Another situation of, is this working time or non-working time? Time spent before or after work is generally not working time. But if it's with it, the courts have said, and the Department of Labor has come on board with this, if the changing of clothing or the washing of an employee is part of the principal activity. So you can imagine like putting on a hazmat suit at the beginning of a shift. If that's principal to the activity that the employee is engaging in for their job, then it's going to be considered working time. And we're going to calculate it toward the number of hours worked in that work week. Same with undressing and washing up. We look at the principal activity, and we have to figure this out. So it's going to come down to every job is different. Lawyers, I often wear a suit. Me putting on a suit in the morning, if I were a non-exempt employee, me putting on a suit in the morning is not going to be principal to my activity, although a suit, many days is required, when I'm in court. I'm still, if I'm non-exempt, I'm still not going to count that toward the principal activity. But if you're at the work site and you're putting on like a hazmat suit, for example, or you're putting on certain gear that's necessary for like safety or whatever it is, principal to the job, then we're going to count it as working time. Also, if somebody hurts themselves during work and they're waiting for medical attention or receiving it, that's going to be considered working time as well. That'd be pretty sweet if you docked somebody pay after a work comp while they're like sitting there waiting for treatment for a work comp injury. This is just some general Fair Labor Standard Act stuff that we kind of already glossed over. One thing, more interesting tidbits and facts that you can take a look at. Interesting, there is no limit to the number of hours that somebody can work a day if they're more than 16 years old. General rule, nobody under the age of 13 can work, but employees who are 14 to 15, there are some restrictions on they can't work in hazardous types of jobs, and there are restrictions, and a lot of states have restrictions on hours and the type of job that they can work. But as a general concept, there's no limit in the number of hours that somebody who's more than 16 or older can work. I think I've covered a bunch of these. Another thing that I should say is there's no entitlement to break. There's no break leave. So not only is there no entitlement to holidays, but under federal law, states have their own laws, and like Illinois and Minnesota has theirs, for example, where you have to get be able to go to the bathroom and have a meal. But at a federal law, there's no entitlement to break. There's no such thing as a 15-minute break law at the federal level. There's no such thing as a lunch break entitlement at the federal level. This is a list of the exempt employees, employees 101. And again, we're not going to really get into these, but this is, if you have employees and they're exempt, they really have to fit in with the duties. They have to meet the duty test. They have to fit in within the duties of these of these job types. So administrative employees, learned professionals, and computer professionals and executives, those are your white collar, we call them the white collar exemptions, right? So for office professional types that are getting the exemption, but there are other exemptions too. You can see taxi drivers and farm workers, and then obviously interstate DOT drivers are for sure exempt if they meet certain criteria. So but to do this, we look at the duties, and then for most of these, especially for administrative, learned, and professional, and computer exemptions, computer and executives, they have to meet like the duty test and the salary basis test for that. And so we have to understand that for all the jobs. We're not going to get too much into this because I want to get back to some of these other working time issues. So meal breaks and rest periods, again, not required under federal law. In Minnesota, you have to allow somebody to go to the bathroom. I know it's draconian, but you have to let them go to the bathroom a couple times during an 8-hour shift. And you know what? Yeah, you even have to pay them for it, which is, pretty ridiculous that you would have to pay somebody to go to the bathroom. But I guess, whatever. Employers can lose a few minutes here and there and probably still be okay in most situations. Except under a bunch of states, you don't have to allow them to eat. So I think the federal law has got it kind of right. I mean, employees should be chained to their desks and not be allowed to go to the bathroom and eat. So I think the federal government gets it, but a lot of these states, they're just pretty loosey-goosey and employee friendly and let people go to the bathroom and have lunches. If you are so inclined to let them have breaks and go to the lunches, go to have a meal, then you have this general principle that if the break or the lunch is less than 30 minutes, then it's going to be considered working time. Practically speaking, I've had enough Department of Labor audits and everything. Practically, you know what? With this administration, who knows? I suspect it'd probably be friendlier, so we're probably still okay here. But for the most part, as a practical rule, if the break is less than 21 minutes, then it's working time. So if the break is 21 minutes or over, it's unpaid time off, and the person would clock out. But less than 21 minutes paid, more than 21 minutes or more unpaid, because the person has enough time to relax. The regulations talk about 30 minutes on this, but practically speaking, Department of Labor audits and stuff, they, in my experience, no guarantees here or anything, but in my experience, if the break is like 21, 22, 23 minutes, the Department of Labor doesn't count that as working time in calculating overtime premium. There's no such thing as a smoke break under federal law. I don't even think there's such thing as a smoke break under any state law that I've ever heard of. Bathroom breaks, so those sorts of, if you want to allow smoke breaks, that's entirely up to you. It's a disciplinary issue. It's something that you're allowing, but there is no entitlement for employees to go and have a smoke, or even go to the bathroom, except in silly states like Minnesota that encourage bathroom breaks. Can you discipline for excessive breaks, for taking too many smoke breaks, for going to the bathroom too much? Yeah, you absolutely can. You just have to pay them for it. So could discipline? Yes. Discipline? Yes. Pay? Yes. Could you even fire them for it? Yeah, absolutely. Just have to watch out if they start asserting rights. You don't want to get a whistleblower claim or a retaliation claim out of it. But yeah, as a general principle, pay and then discipline. Interns. A lot of companies mess up the intern thing, so I'm just going to throw this. So I wanted to throw a slide on this, but here are the questions that you need to ask yourself on an intern, and they're actually right here. Is it similar? Is it similar to training which can be given in an educational environment? And the real thing with interns is this replicating an academic program, or are you really just kind of filling a job with an intern? If you're really just kind of filling a job with an intern and you otherwise would be paying somebody for this job, you're probably not. It's probably not an unpaid internship. Now, if you're paying this intern, that's fine. Then no big deal. A paid intern, you call it a paid intern, that's fine. Realistically, it's a paid employee, but that's fine. You call it a paid intern if you want. But but if you're doing it for the benefit, is it for the benefit of the intern or is it for the benefit of the company? If it's for the benefit of the intern, like they're getting educational credits for it, they're learning, they're personally benefiting from this, then it's going to be more likely to be an intern. But you have to meet like all these criteria. Does the intern displace a regular employee? Again, are you just filling a job with an intern? If the answer is yes, it's not an intern, it's an employee. Does the intern work under close supervision of existing staff? If no, then it's not an intern. If you're supervising closely an intern because you're there to help them out, then that looks like an internship. Does the employer provide the training that derives no immediate advantage from the activity? So are you potentially losing money on this deal? Are you, because of all the training time that you're giving? Then if so, then you're looking at more of it can be an intern. Could you even be lose money? Could your operations be impeded? If yes, then it's an intern. If no, if you're only benefiting from this person's work, then that's an employee. It's not an intern. And we need to calculate they're entitled to minimum wage then, and you calculate all their hours if they're an employee and not an intern. Is there an entitlement to a job at the end? If yes, then that's not an intern, that's an employee. And again, all the hours worked by the intern should be considered working time. Similarly, with volunteers and volunteering, if you're looking for volunteers for a private company, for not a nonprofit. So if you're not a nonprofit and you're looking for volunteers, that's a very rare, almost unheard of situation where that can be legitimately unpaid. Nonprofits get a little bit more of a break because if you look at the criteria here, one of the main criteria is this at least in part, is the service that you're being asked to, is this at least for humanitarian reasons? So for example, I mean, if you're as a company, if you just say, hey, looking for volunteers, we're going to go over and volunteer for Habitats for Humanity, and we're going to, do that, or we're going to go to United Way or something like that, then that's for humanitarian reasons. It's voluntary. There's no coercion there. There's no expectation that the person shows up. There's no guarantee like, hey, you come and you're going to get a promotion. There's nothing like that. Then we're talking about a voluntary situation for current employees. If you're trying to bring in a volunteer to do, quote, work, and that work's not humanitarian, and that work wouldn't normally be paid, and you're not paying nominal fees, it's not necessary. If it smells bad, it's an employee, and you should be paying them minimum wage, and you should be counting those as hours worked. But if it truly is for humanitarian reasons, and that's why nonprofits have it's much easier for nonprofits to get away with this than for-profit companies, just because how many for-profit companies are bringing on people to be volunteers for humanitarian reasons. Like that's not the purpose of most for-profit companies. Okay, we're gonna skip this. We're gonna go to training time on the same type of issue. Again, is this working time? Is the training, and a lot of times employees think that they're entitled to wages because they're going out of town and they're going to trainings and meetings, and that's not always true. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. But if there's training or even if it's going and taking classes at a local college, that's part and parcel of the job. The question is the training outside the normal working hours? If the training's outside the normal working hours, it might not be compensable. It might not be, quote, working time. If it's during the normal working hours, it's going to be working time. It's going to be working time. You're going to have to pay the employee. Is it voluntary? If the answer is yes, if it's truly voluntary, no coercion or anything, if the answer is yes, then it's outside the normal working hours, then it could be non-working time. Is it directly related to the job? If the answer is yes, then it's going to be working time. Is there any concurrent work being performed? Obviously, if you're sitting there doing emails during the training stuff, it's going to be working time. Doesn't matter who's paying for it. Doesn't matter that the company's paying for it. It could still not be working time as long as it's outside normal working hours. It's voluntary for the employee's benefit, not directly related to the job, but indirectly related to the job. That's fine. Even if the company's paying for it, it doesn't matter. That still could be non-working time. Other social events, you can see parties, conferences, that sort of thing. if it's not required, and outside of the hours and meets these other criteria, it's not going to be working time. A lot of times employees think that they're entitled to pay for everything. Okay, a couple more concepts, and then I got to call it here. There's just so much to do in this presentation, but we're going to get through almost all of it. So DeMinimis time. There's this concept that you can round time by a few minutes each day. If it's beyond 10, no way. It's like 10 or more, no way. But if it's less than 10, you can actually round as long as you're rounding, as long as your payroll system is set up to round to both your advantage and disadvantage. So what do I mean by that? If you're on like a 5-minute payroll system, and so at like 7:55, it's going to it's a 6-minute payroll system, it's a 0.1, right? So if it's 7:54 and that's 6 minutes before 8 o'clock and they start at 8 o'clock, if they clock in 6 minutes in advance, you're not going to round them up to 8 o'clock if they're there and they're ready to work. You wouldn't want to do that, right? You can't round them up. They clocked in 6 minutes early. But if they clock in like 2 minutes early, you could round them up to 8 o'clock. So if they clock in at 7:54, no, but if they clock in at 7:58, yes, under this de minimis rule, because because of the way rounding works with time management systems, you can do this rounding by a few minutes here and there, and it's still okay under the de minimis rule. Depends on your software, depends on the payroll system you're using. A lot of payroll systems will do current time, like down to the exact 100ths and stuff, which is great. But if you don't have that type of system and you're on more of like a standard like 6 or 10 or 15 minute clocking system, then that's a little bit different, and you're going to get into these rounding rules. But again, if it's more than 10 minutes, and if this happens like every day, that you as the employer get like 8 or 9 minutes of free working time, that's going to be problematic. So a lot of circumstances get played into this, but as a general concept, you could round here and there, both to your advantage and disadvantage by a few minutes every day for an employee. Last thing on travel time, and then I'm going to call the webinar, and I really appreciate everybody's attendance. So on travel time, this is the Portal to Portal Act, if you're familiar with it, with the Fair Labor as an amendment to the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the question really is, again, it's working time. So is the travel that the employee is engaged in, again, non-exempt employee, is the travel that the employee is engaging in, is that considered working time? And here, if it's out of town travel, so regular commuting distance is not. So regular commuting distance is not going to be working time. But if it's out of town travel and the employee's going and they're driving and they're going out of town and it's outside the regular commuting distance, that's going to be working time. Definitely all the travel during normal working hours, and normal working hours are not just normal working days, they're normal working hours. So if the normal working hours are 8 to 5 and the non-exempt employee travels on Saturday, but they normally work Monday through Friday, but they travel Saturday from 8 to 12, that cuts across the working time with the normal working hours day. So they're definitely going to be in line for 4 hours of compensation as working time there. But if you're traveling outside the regular working hours, outside the regular working day, then there's a potential chance that it's not working time if the employee is able to relax. So if they're at a hotel and they're at restaurants and they're definitely able to relax, it's not going to be considered working time. If they're on a plane outside working hours, if they're on a plane, if they're on a bus or on a train, it's not going to be considered working hours. If they're driving in the backseat of a car or in a van, it's not going to be regular working time as well, as long as it's outside the regular working hours. So we want employees to, when they travel out of town, when they take plane rides, when they have to travel far distances, we want them to actually travel outside the regular working hours, and we want them to travel on a plane, because then we don't have to pay them. Then when they land, they go to the hotel and they can relax, and you don't have to pay them. So they're not like on the clock for 24 hours here. So there are a lot of nuances to this. One thing that I think is interesting is that if you say, hey, you've got to go from like New York to LA, and I want you to travel outside, after 5 o'clock when your workday ends, and you know what, here's the plane ticket, take the plane and go. And the person says, I've always wanted to drive across the country. I'm going to drive across the country and you're going to have to pay me for it because when I'm driving, I'm entitled to pay. It's working time. But you can actually say, no, that doesn't work. I've offered the opportunity for you to relax on a plane or on a train across the country. You've turned me down. It's not working time. Enjoy your trip across the country. I'm not going to call that working time and not going to pay you for it. Another thing that you can do is you can look at, with working time, say to somebody that you're going to pay them at a different rate when they're traveling. A lot of employers don't do that, but could you? Yes, you could have a different rate structure for employees that are like when they're traveling, like you pay them maybe minimum wage or something like that when they're traveling versus when they're actually doing like normal stuff. So you could have a different structure for wages, for hourly rate there. Here are a number of tips. Some of this which I just mentioned. Asking an employee to track the time. You still need to track the time and get the hours and all that from them so that you can figure out what their number of hours are in the week. And I've already talked about all that. That's it. We're done. 12:57. Okay. Thank you for your attendance. For those of you that need the certification credits, you will be sent that in email in the next week or so. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me directly at 651-389-5007, or you can email me at kmosher@thompsonco.com. I appreciate your attendance, and I look forward to our presentation in 1 month. Thank you.